Good morning, everyone. This is John with Gun Deals, and today we're going to be taking a look at the refreshed and updated Primary Arms MD25 Gen 2. I actually have both the ACSS CQB version and the simple 2 MOA dot version here to review and talk about. But before we get into all of that, if you'd like to help us out, you can, of course, like, share, and subscribe, as that is all free and it does help us out quite a bit. On top of that, go ahead and comment your favorite plus size red dot in the comments down below. Now, full disclosure on both of these red dots is that I have a working relationship with Primary Arms. They sent out both of these red dots to me to review for free, so I did not pay for them whatsoever. So again, just keep that in mind going forward, that I do have a relationship with Primary Arms and they send me stuff for free. Now, getting into the specifics of the red dot, as the name implies, the MD25. This is a slightly increased size red dot. So instead of like your standard micro red dots, aimpoint T1, T2 style of red dots, this is going to be a 25 millimeter window versus a 20 millimeter window. What that means is you get a little bit more room through the glass itself, which some people might find preferable. Now, I am somebody who does like larger window red dots. You should be able to see a SIG Romeo 8T behind me. That's my favorite red dot. EOTech, so on and so forth. Other red dots that have big windows, I do tend to be a fan of. It's not necessarily that it will actually increase your performance, of course, because we're all shooting with both eyes open, so you're going to see everything anyways. But sometimes it is nice to see more through the glass itself versus like looking through a tiny little tube that might obstruct some things right around your target. So having a little bit more room around your target through the glass itself, some people might like that, and I do tend to be one of those people. Though again, that is definitely going to be a personal preference thing, not necessarily something that just everybody needs. Now, getting into specifics on the MD25, we have, of course, a 25 millimeter objective lens. This one here is the ACSS CQB reticle, which we'll go into a little bit more detail later on. The body itself is, I believe, 6061 T6 aluminum, very standard there. In terms of size and weight, it is about 3 inches long, about 2 inches wide with the battery cap and the windage cap, and comes in at a weight of 6.5 ounces. Now, when we talk about the mount, it is fortunately your standard T1, T2 style of mount, so most, or if not all, of your aftermarket T1, T2 mounts will absolutely fit, so you can get it to whatever height that you want. However, it does come with a low mount, with a absolute, so a 141, a 151, if I'm getting that right, so a 141, 154, and 163 as well. So it comes with the low mount, the standard absolute, and then 2 different riser plates to get you to whatever height that you want. If you want a super tall mount, like a 175, 193, so on and so forth, you can get an aftermarket T1, T2 style mount, but it does come with a lot of different mounting options in the box. Currently, as you see it, it is at the lower 1/3 or the 163 that I do tend to prefer, if not a little bit taller, because of course I am using a 1/2 inch riser on top of that for the red dot and the magnifier. Now, fortunately, the mount design itself is fairly good. You have 2 large steel cross bolts that thread into steel inserts on the other side, a very large locking block, 2 recoil lugs on the bottom of the mount itself, so you get a lot of contact on your rail. The recoil lugs provide a hard stop during recoil, so again, you have the best chance possible of retaining 0 after a sharp impact, which we did test, and we'll get into that a little bit later on. As far as controls go, on the left-hand side, we have our battery tray and, of course, our illumination settings, which will go all the way from 0 to 11. The first 2 settings are night vision settings. I have not tested those. I do not have NOD, so I do not know how well those work. Presumably, there is some circumstance in which they will work fine, though only 2 of them, from what I've heard, can tend to be an issue, especially when we're talking about a very large reticle like this. If it's a little bit too bright, it'll start to bloom out super fast because, again, there's a lot going on with this reticle. Fortunately, of course, for the rest of the daylight settings or the rest of the normal settings, 11 is very bright, and if you don't need that, you can always dial it back just a little bit, but it does get more than daylight bright. Now, updated in the Gen 2, the newest improvement to them is going to be the fact that these now come standard with AutoLive technology, meaning that they will shut off after a certain amount of time and then turn back on. Now, with the ACSS CQB version, the battery life is rated at 12,000 hours at a medium setting. So probably think 5,000 to 7,000 hours in a more usable brightness setting, so a higher brightness setting, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, something like that. But because it has auto on, auto off, it turns off, I believe, after 15 minutes or so. Once it turns off, it's of course saving that battery life. So really, you're looking at 5,000 to 7,000 hours of use of the battery or of the optic, which means that you probably are getting 1 to 2 years, if not more, depending on how much you're actually using it. As of right now, I've had these optics for quite some time now, since they came out. So 3-4 months at this point, and the AutoLive has been perfect. Every time I pick it up, it's already on to the last setting, because of course it just saves the last setting that you use, and it works perfectly fine. Now, I know on the original versions that did not have AutoLive technology, people were going through batteries basically every month, which is not too much fun if you forget to turn your red dot off and you pick it up, you know, a couple weeks later and hey, your battery's dead. Never a fun thing to run into, but fortunately, that issue is completely removed with the Gen 2 version. Not that the battery life is fantastic, but it is quite a bit better than what you're going to get, especially on the Gen 1 version, and certainly going to extend it 6 months, a year at least. Now, important to note, on the 2 MOA version, which is a little bit cheaper, it's of course a little bit simpler, only using a 2 MOA dot. This one here has a rated battery life, I believe, of 50,000 hours combined with AutoLive technology, so auto on, auto off. So this one here will last basically forever, as long as that battery can hold a charge and power an emitter. Now, the 2 MOA dot version is, of course, much simpler. It's a little bit cheaper, but other than that, the specs are basically the same. This one here, you can tell, is marked up quite a bit. At this point, I believe these have encountered 6 shoulder height drops collectively, 4 on this one, and then 2 on the 2 MOA dot version, and they're still working just fine, for a little bit of a spoiler alert later on. The 2 MOA dot version is, for all intents and purposes, exactly the same, minus the reticle, and I believe it's like $10 cheaper, which, depending on your use case for it, maybe that's enough, plus the extended battery life, of course, to choose this over the CQB, depending on if you need the reticle. Speaking of the reticle, the last thing that we need to talk about before we get into performance is, of course, the Acss CQB reticle. Now, this is based off of a center chevron design and a outer horseshoe, so you have a 2/3 horseshoe on the outer side for really quick acquisition. Up close, you can basically just put that on a target and pull the trigger, and you're going to be getting an acceptable hit. It also doubles as a little bit of auto ranging, so I believe that is kind of standard buckshot pattern at 25 yards. So you could mount this to a shotgun, which this one here was actually mounted to a shotgun for a little bit of time. So it has some extra auto ranging features in there as well that are nice that you're going to get with ACSS style reticles. Now, with that center chevron, you of course have a very fine tip that unfortunately does not always look good under magnification. Sometimes it looks very sharp and very crisp and is very nice to just put somewhere, and you can be very precise with it, much more precise than just like a 2 MOA dot. However, sometimes, depending on your magnifier and your diopter settings, sometimes it just does not look very good. And I have perfect vision, no astigmatism, and sometimes it will kind of like wash out or get a little bit wavy, depending on what magnifier you're using it, what head position you're in, so on and so forth. When it works optimally, it is very good. It is very precise. On top of that, you also have holds for 300, 400, and 500 yards, I want to say. So you do, of course, have some of that distance capability as well, much more than like just a standard red dot without any sort of, you know, BDC or auto ranging features. So when it's working optimally, the Acss CQB reticle looks very good. It's very sharp, very crisp, very precise. And of course, you do have that extended range capabilities when combined with a magnifier. That is going to make it much easier to get on target at, again, those more extended distances for a red dot. Again, in maybe half the time I was using it out to distance, or even just in close range, using it for like the drop test for like zeroing and stuff like that, and trying to be as precise as possible, depending on my head position and magnifier that I was using. Sometimes it would just look a little blurry, and then, you know, I'd rather just have a 2 MOA dot that's not as blurry as like a chevron that's starting to wave out a little bit. Right now in this configuration, it looks very good, but you might need to play around with it a little bit to find the most optimum settings to make sure that it looks as good as possible for the majority of the time. Overall, I do think that the Acss CQB reticle is done very well. It has basically all of the features you could want in a red dot. It's obviously not going to be as complex as some of the other ACSS reticles out there, but for a red dot, I think that it works very well, being a good blend of speed and precision. Just note that for me anyways, on this one, it didn't always look quite perfect. And so sometimes it would actually be a little bit of a hindrance, and I would rather just have a 2 MOA dot, though when it's working perfectly, it is very nice. Now, getting into the performance of the dot itself, what it was like to actually use this red dot, well, it is a bit of a tale of two cities, because of course you do have the slightly larger window, which I do prefer. However, the body of the red dot itself is really, really thick. You have this huge battery tray hanging off on this side, and then of course you have your windage and elevation. So it is a very, very thick red dot. So yes, you do see a little bit more through it, but then of course you get a lot more obstructed. If they could make the caps a little bit more low profile, if they could put the battery tray in a different location, maybe on top would have been better, honestly, you would get a much more clean sight picture with less obstruction around it. So while it is nice to have a slightly larger window, I do prefer that sort of thing. Overall, you end up seeing as little or maybe less than like a 20mm red dot, because of course a 20mm red dot usually is going to be a little bit more low profile in the body. You see a little bit less through the optic itself, but because it's more low profile through the body, you get less obstruction. So there is a big trade-off going there. Now, not that the MD25 is unusable by any means. It is perfectly fine to use, combined with a good reticle, decent glass quality. It does have a bit of a blue notch filter to it that is very noticeable, but that's there to help, extend that battery life out. Overall, I think using the red dot is perfectly fine. However, using a 20mm red dot is also perfectly fine. So you're getting a bit of a size and weight penalty without much benefit. So this reticle in the Holosun 503G, that might be a much better option than the MD25, just because you're getting a smaller, lighter footprint with less obstruction, slightly smaller window, but you're getting the same reticle feature set in a better body style. For me, I would like to see the body redone a little bit to be a little bit more low profile. I do like the large window design, but the large window design isn't going to help you if the body is then more obstructive, right? So I'd like to get the best of both worlds instead of a bit of a mixed bag. Now, fortunately, when we talk about durability, this is an area where both of the red dots did very well over multiple shoulder height drops. So for instance, I've done a video on these on my personal channel, the Focus Strip channel as well, and they both did very well during those shoulder height drops, and I also did 2 more shoulder height drops for this video. So starting off, we do a 5-round control group at, I believe, 50 yards for these, and then we go ahead and do 1 shoulder height drop onto dirt and rocks. The first shoulder height drop, perfectly fine. We see about maybe an inch shift in point of aim, point of impact. So that means that you have about a 2 MOA shift after a shoulder height drop, which is probably the harshest drop that anybody is going to run into in a normal circumstance. And then I went ahead and did another shoulder height drop, this time onto, I believe, an AR500 steel plate. And we got, again, about 1 inch point of impact shift, meaning about 2 MOA. Again, so it doesn't hold 0 perfectly, but it holds pretty darn well after, again, probably the harshest impacts you're ever going to run into. On top of that, both of the red dots are perfectly fine, again, after about 6 drops at this point. No issues with either of them in terms of function. Both batteries are still going quite strong, so no issues there. Durability does seem to be very good. Recoil holding abilities are fine. They're not necessarily the best that I've seen, but they're definitely decent. If you're shooting inside of 100, 200 yards, 1, 2 MOA is not going to matter all that much as long as you're doing your part. But it is, again, just something that you should note, that the recoil holding or the 0 holding of the optics is very good, if not perfect. When it comes to the value persuasion, I think that these are both right around the $200 mark, with, again, the CQB ACSS version being a little bit more expensive. If you already had a Gen 1 MD25 and you really liked it, or all the feature set using it, the reticle, so on and so forth, but you hated the fact that it didn't have auto on, auto off, well, this fixes all of those issues. If you don't have one and you don't need the reticle, then it's not necessarily something that I would recommend just straight up switching to. If you already have a good red dot, your red dot that you have is going to serve you perfectly fine. And if you're looking for that reticle, I personally prefer, again, the Holosun 503G with their ACSS, well, same reticle, but, and again, the Holosun 503 body. That is kind of where I would push you towards if you're looking for that reticle, which is again a very good reticle when it's working perfectly. The MD25 is really only going to be limited to those who really want that bigger body or that bigger optic window and are willing to sacrifice the fact that you have a more obstructive, bigger body as well. So it is definitely kind of a trade-off there in terms of window size and then, of course, body size. So do I think that they're good red dots? Perfectly fine. If you find one on a good deal, I know that the Gen 1s were on sale for like $100, and for $100, they're pretty darn good. Again, they are missing auto on, auto off technology, which is a little bit frustrating, especially if you just forget to turn them off. They're going to die on you fairly quickly, especially the ACSS version. Overall, I do think that they are good red dots. They performed quite well. They were easy to use. They're not perfect, and they're not necessarily the pinnacle of value, but for some people, if you like the feature set, you like the window size, you don't mind the body, they're going to work just fine for you. Are they the best for everybody? I personally don't think so. But with all of that out of the way, guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. I will see you in the next one. Peace off.